Hello and welcome to episode 15, no less, of the Talk Diaries. Now, we know in the past few weeks there has been an enormous amount of discussion about Greenland, and this has led to a lot of discussion also about the Arctic in general, what it has to offer and why the president is so animated about not just Greenland but also Canada and Russia's access to the Arctic. So we thought we'd do a little bit of looking at maps this time around, and I'm delighted to have with me David Baillie. David has been making documentaries in the Arctic for now 3 decades. He is a founder of Wildcat Films, and he has showed me a film, in fact, that he's made in the Arctic, which is, well, it's certainly ice-breaking and groundbreaking to David, I think, and has excited a great deal of interest from a number of perspectives, not just the commercial, but also the environmental. Welcome to the Talk Diaries.
Thank you very much. Very pleased to be here.
I think we should start talking about maps, shouldn't we? Because it wasn't really until I sort of looked at the Arctic, you realise because it's so high up towards the North Pole, when you're whizzing around on the map, you keep getting back to Russia, whichever way you go, very, very quickly. And if you're further down towards the equator and you're whizzing around on a map, it takes a lot longer. So it's important for us to understand these shipping routes and how they might be opening up. Now, everybody knows that ice is melting, right? And nowhere is that more true than the Arctic. We'll come back to why, or maybe we should explain that now. Let's just talk actually briefly about why in the Arctic is it melting quicker than anywhere else?
The climate's changing obviously around the world, and there's a rise in temperatures. The actual effect on melting ice is happening at about 3 times the rate in the Arctic as in the Antarctic, and that's because most of the ice in the Arctic is sea ice. It's basically covering dark water. So what happens is, as global warming is beginning to get into the water, and the water is getting warmer and beginning to melt the ice, areas of of sea without any reflective ice are being exposed. Now, interestingly, one of the reasons why the Arctic was originally so cold is because it is cold because it's snow, and therefore it reflects back a lot of the sun's radiation. Once you start melting the ice, you're increasing the area of sea, dark sea, that can receive the warmth of the sun's rays. And unlike the ice, which reflects the heat out, the dark water absorbs it. And therefore the water there is getting warmer quicker than anywhere else in the world. And therefore more ice is melting, and therefore the ice is melting more quickly. And basically, the rate of climate change in the Arctic is between 3 and 4 times as fast as the rest of the planet. And it's called Arctic amplification.
Okay, let's go to the map gazing then. When we look at the Arctic, is it possible to say what it is we mean? Because I then want to move on to passages through the Arctic and why these become important. What do we mean by the Arctic?
Well, the various definitions of the Arctic, there is of course something called the Arctic Circle, which is 66 degrees north, which effectively is determined by the way the Earth tilts on its axis to the sun. So anything above this sort of circular line called the Arctic Circle has at least one day in winter when there is no sun. And that's kind of call it a geographic definition. Sometimes people think of the Arctic as being an area that's not actually defined by that particular line, but an area where the temperature of the warmest month is normally the average is below 10 degrees. And that means a lot of Canada that is below the Arctic Circle is sometimes called the Arctic. The other word that you hear a lot about, especially in terms of sort of geopolitics and military, is the high north, which is a kind of a general term that refers to the northern part of Europe that isn't quite up as far as the Arctic, but extends into the Arctic, above the Arctic Circle, and politically is kind of relevant to strategic issues up there. But the one thing I would say about maps, and it's really important, is that we grow up at school always looking at a projection of the world known as normally like the Mercator projection.
Yeah.
And you just have to throw that away when you're talking about the Arctic. There is only one way to understand the Arctic, and that's with a view of a map where you're looking down at the North Pole. And suddenly you realise what all the issues are about and how close countries are together. East of Russia is very close to the west of Alaska, just by about 50 kilometres. When you look down from the pole, both continental areas are actually facing each other. Um, and so definitely don't start thinking about the Arctic unless you have a map that's looking down from the North Pole.
As you were talking about the east of Russia, I was laughing to myself and remembering Sarah Palin, the US politician, who said that she looked out of her window in Alaska and she could see Russians in the distance.
Yes, yeah,
I
that's
may
it.
have been hallucinating there. But anyway, there we are. The point is, it's all very close. So if we think about this map, the question is what ships, if we are to be commercially viable, to what extent can ships go through the Arctic? So when we're talking about the Northwest Passage, we are talking about between Greenland and there's all these other kind of bits of islands. To what extent can ships get through that to shorten their shipping route and get from the Pacific over to the Atlantic? That's the question, isn't it?
Well, there are a couple of major shipping routes that are just beginning to become opened up because of the melting of the Arctic ice. Normally, only still in summer. Still a lot of permanent ice in winter. But the two key ones are what's called the Northern Sea Route. And this is the route that really follows the Russian coastline. If you can imagine coming out of Shanghai, which is where a lot of the ships will be coming from now, and they're going north and around sort of the edge, the eastern edge of Russia, and then along the top coast from east to west of the Russian coast. To get through now, you have to go quite close to the Russian coastline. And that's often within Russian territorial waters. And in fact, the Russians say they control that route, and basically you can only traverse that route if you go with their permission, with their escorts. But that route is open now. There are already tankers bringing liquid natural gas across there, and also container ships from China going to places like Rotterdam. That's open and is being increasingly used. The Northwest Passage, which is the sort of the equivalent route, but over the top of the North American continent, i.e. really the top of Alaska and then the top of Canada, that is much more difficult at the moment. It's harder to navigate. It goes through a much more sort of complex range of islands, and not all of the ice can be guaranteed to be clear in summer. So it can be traversed. You know, cruise ships have done it. The Canadian Navy, the Canadian Defence Forces can obviously navigate it, but at the moment it's not really a very commercially viable option. It will be, and the
As the
long
ice
term,
melts, presumably.
yeah, and the long term aim is that, well, expectation is that when the ice melts almost completely in summer, it will be possible to traverse right across over the top of the North Pole, which would be the shortest route from either China to Europe or
Over
from
the top of the earth.
Alaska
Oh my
to
goodness.
Europe. Yeah.
Okay. So again, looking at this map, it's important to remind ourselves that Russia sits really sort of on the top of Asia. So anything that goes along that northern coastline of Russia can go clean over Asia, as you've indicated. And that is the Arctic, much of it. And actually, a lot of Russia's coastline is in the Arctic, isn't it? And then it could come down, I suppose, and head south. Or the other possibility is, having done that route, why would it necessarily go through past Greenland? It wouldn't. It would probably go around the other way if it was going to do that, wouldn't it?
Well, the other thing to remember, as well as commercial shipping, is for the Russians, it's also a really important military shipping route. Half of their fleet, their main nuclear fleet, is based in the Russian Arctic, and the only way that it can get to the Atlantic Ocean and around the world really is to come through the gap that's known as the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, which basically is what it says on the tin. It's the gap between Greenland past Iceland to the UK, and that is a very strategic gap. So at the moment, a lot of Western defence strategy is based on making sure that they have control of that gap, because the Russian military vessels will come out of the port of Murmansk, the Kola Peninsula, where they're based, and they need to get access down there. And that's down through the eastern side of Greenland.
Yeah.
The passage up the western side of Greenland is pretty narrow and not really navigable at the moment. But
So
in terms
actually,
of,
when we're talking about, when Donald Trump is talking about the threat from Russia, let's just get a grip on what he's saying here. He is saying that those military bases have been bolstered, which they have, haven't they, on the Russian coast, and also that they already have ownership and control of that route, That's really what he's pointing to, is it?
Yes, and he's also pointing to the fact that he thinks he needs early warning radar bases that kind of can look over the top of the Arctic. Um, I think there's a mixture here between the actual strategic and military needs and President Trump's desire to own a big chunk of Greenland. In terms of military strategy, the Americans used to have 17 bases in Greenland, and they deliberately decided to move to one base, a place called Patufik, which is where their main early warning radar base is now.
Mm.
They could, in terms of the agreement they had with the Danes, recolonize those 17 bases and put up new radar stations. They don't really need them. I mean, it's very difficult to know the real strategic. If you talk to military people in the Pentagon, as I do, it's very difficult to get a strategic reason for why the US would need to actually own the whole of Greenland when it has access to 17 locations where it could build whatever it likes.
Well, is it possible that the cost of recolonizing those bases would be high, and if you can offset that because you think that there is access to minerals and get mining of those minerals to pay for it, then you're beginning to converge those two concerns, the military or the geopolitical one and the commercial one.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is incredibly expensive. That's why the Americans pulled out of those bases and concentrated all their resources at Patufic, because it is very expensive to maintain bases there. There is a misunderstanding about mineral exploitation in Greenland and the Arctic in general. It's true that there are resources there, both of oil and gas and critical minerals and the rare earth minerals. There's no doubt about that because geological surveys have shown them to be there. However, they are notoriously difficult to exploit in Greenland. There are only two working mines in the whole of Greenland at the moment. One's a gold mine that has actually closed down in the past because it became so marginal to operate. It reopened when the price of gold went up. There's another mine that produces something called anorthosite, which is a kind of a substance that's used in paint. It's not a particularly important critical mineral. There have only been two mines trying to exploit rare earth minerals, which is what Trump often talks about. The first one has basically ceased exploration because to get the rare earth minerals out would create a large number of radioactive uranium tailings.
Yeah.
And the Greenlandic government has said, look, you can't mine there because we don't want those distributed into the environment. The other mine has, I think they've already invested, I think $200 million in trying to make it into a commercially viable mine for rare earth minerals. At the moment, they don't expect to even start extracting them for a couple of years. So it's very, very difficult to commercially exploit minerals in Greenland. So it's a little bit of
It's a bit of a pipe dream at the moment. But
yeah.
you see press reports saying that the so-called tech bros have been using AI to look at ways of extracting it and so on. I mean, is it naive to say you don't need a whole lot of it necessarily, so you wouldn't be building a big mine, or is that not really
It's the problem with rare earth minerals is that the mining is only half. Well, it's probably less than half the problem.
It's
You've
the
then got to
refining.
process them, and probably at the moment the cost of extracting and processing is so marginal. The other real problem with mining in Greenland is another climate change issue because the climate is warming. A lot of the land that is currently permafrost and nice and hard, and you can build buildings on it and roads and everything else, is becoming very boggy as the permafrost melts. And that is actually increasing the cost and difficulty of establishing mining operations in somewhere like Greenland. So it's not an easy option, and I think it's kind of used as a political reason for doing things. But I don't think when you actually talk to the people involved in the mining industry, they see it as particularly relevant.
Okay, so why is Donald Trump placing such emphasis on Greenland, do you think? I mean, again, looking at a map, you can see, although the two are not close in actual terms, if you look at a map, Canada, Greenland, you can see them as some kind of block. part of that continent, you might say, well, if that's part of his thinking, and we rely at the moment not on academics but on psychologists really to try to unpick what it is that he's up to. But why that focus particularly, do you think, on Greenland, given what it is that you've said? Do you think that the fact that Russia is able, from a military or commercial perspective, to sail along that northern coast and have the access point that it does that leave the US exposed?
No, in fact, I think, again, talking with the US military, often off the record, their concern is actually completely the other side, is Alaska. There are very few incursions of Russian.
So this is then the west side, because we've been
the west
talking
side,
about
yeah,
the Russians coming
yeah,
from the east.
yeah.
You're saying the other route, which is where Sarah Palin said she could already see Russians.
Yeah.
Because that, just talk a bit about the geography of that, if you would.
Well, there is this gap, obviously, between the east of Russia and Alaska, the Bering Sea, Bering Straits. And the point is that's nearer Russia than Greenland is, and it's also nearer China, which are the two main foes as far as the Americans are concerned. And in fact, there's a lot of resources, US military resources, based in Alaska, simply because most of the testing incursions of Russian and Chinese aircraft happen in that area. They keep coming in and trying to enter US airspace over Alaska. Hardly anything Russian or Chinese is that bothered about Greenland, and the incursions over there are minimal. So again, it's very difficult to understand why there is this sort of increased sort of concern about Greenland from a national security point of view. A lot of analysts will say it is part of what has been termed, and I think even Trump calls it occasionally, the Donroe doctrine, that he feels he needs to be in total control of his hemisphere. The point is that Greenland is effectively a NATO country, like Canada.
Yes.
We're in an alliance, and therefore it's not as if it's a neutral, empty area that needs to be particularly colonized to increase security.
No, indeed. So, given that, let's just come back to what Donald Trump is saying about owning Greenland and so on. He is not the first US leader who has talked about some sort of transaction over Greenland, is he? There's a history here. And I just wonder if it's something that's going to keep coming back for one reason or another, or do you think the issue has been put to bed?
I think probably after the level of political action in Davos, it probably has been put to bed. I think there's a feeling that it will gradually calm down. It may well be that he decides to open up some of those military bases that he has the rights to open up in Greenland. But again, the costs will be quite prohibitive, probably. So we will see. But I think, but the people I talk to who basically spend their lives worrying about this feel that, in fact, that the worst is over, and that we're hopefully approaching a period of calm and a return to kind of the normal operations of the NATO alliance, which is basically combined cooperative work across the whole area.
David, what is your fascination with the Arctic? Is it the environmental aspect? Is it the strategic aspect? Why are you so fascinated with it? And you've been there multiple times. No small cost.
It's very different.
Quite cold.
I'm much better in cold places physically. It's easier to put clothes on. I filmed in very hot places.
It's quite easy to take them off, actually. So I'm told.
But the Arctic I find fascinating. The wildlife there is amazing. I've done filming for Attenborough series up there, polar bears, and it's just extraordinary in Wales, extraordinary area. And although I love Antarctica as well, and I've worked there, it's a lot easier getting to the Arctic than the Antarctic, and it has that level of geopolitics that is interesting. That I think one day the same will happen in the Antarctic, but at the moment it's such an interesting area in terms of geopolitics and climate change and natural history. It's just everything, and it's visually stunning.
And how long will it be? We've talked about going from the east to the west to the east through the Arctic and what that might open up. But you've said there is another route, and that is over the North Pole. But that's how long away is that?
Very difficult to say. That climatologists talk about an ice-free Arctic, which actually, in their definition, is entirely ice-free. It's when the summer ice reduces to a certain amount. I can't remember the exact figure, but it will be an amount where it will be possible to basically sail an ice-strengthened ship, not necessarily an icebreaker, but what's called an ice-strengthened ship, right the way across the top of the North Pole, which is obviously the quickest way from A to B, from Asia to Europe or to North America, the east coast of North America. And that will mean that the key thing is that means that route is not in Russian territorial waters, and therefore it is more of an open area. We do get into complicated areas of things called exclusive economic zones, and that is a kind of a battle that will be, I think, more relevant in the years to come.
When we talk about that, we haven't yet touched on the environmental impact of all of this. You talk about icebreakers. I don't know how they work. These or these. What did you say? The ice
strengthened ships. Yeah.
Okay, so they are just very robust, are they, from a metallurgical point of view?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. There's probably an engineering specification, but I'm not quite sure what it is. But basically, yeah, it means that they can go in areas where they might be hitting just little bits of small icebergs and things, whereas an icebreaker can actually break a path through solid sheet ice.
Right. What is the impact on the environment of all of this?
Well, the other impact is that obviously as the ice melts, it makes it easier to exploit natural resources in the Arctic. We've been talking a bit about mining in Greenland, but probably a more relevant source are the minerals on the seabed in the Arctic. Again, if you lose the Arctic sea ice, you're able to extract minerals from the seabed, and that might be a simpler way to get critical and rare earth minerals because they're in kind of nodules on the seabed. You don't have to dig down deeply. The other resource, which I think sometimes people don't think about that much, is fish. The world is running out of protein, China particularly. China is desperate to start fishing more in the Arctic. It needs that protein to feed its population because as climate change makes it more difficult to create enough foodstuffs on the land in China, they are looking to marine protein and fish. And China is making more breakers at the moment than any other nation on Earth, and its fishing fleet is basically beginning to expand into the Arctic, and they're waiting for the full ice to melt to enable them to get that fish.
A friend of mine said in America she bought in the supermarket some fish which turned out to be Chinese Arctic fish.
Yes.
And so that also, when we think of the Arctic, we think about polar bears. What is the impact on them?
Polar bears, they're having a hard time. Obviously, they rely on sea ice to move around. They can swim very well, but not great long distances. And that means they're becoming isolated in certain areas that they can't traverse as widely as they used to. The other issue about polar bears, my very first film in the Arctic was about, is toxic pollution in the Arctic food chain. Polar bears are at the very top of the Arctic food chain, along with the Inuits, and therefore the toxic pollutants that are being released in the sort of southern latitudes from Europe, industrial processes in North America and the rest of the world, are gradually concentrated as they move up the food chain through plankton, through small crustaceans to fish, seals and polar bears. And so very high levels of toxic pollutants are being found both in polar bears and in Inuit mother's milk in the Arctic. So that's another environmental problem that we're beginning to see up there.
Well, which is where we probably should be focusing rather than anywhere else. David, thank you so much for your time.
With pleasure. Thank you.